a change in the conversation about smallholders and the way we're looking at smallholders. So we have 3 interesting speakers. They all speak about 20-25 minutes. After every speaker, there's an opportunity to ask 1 or 2 clarifications. And at the end, we have about half an hour for discussion. So we have 3 different speakers speaking on very different topics. And that reflects actually the fact that the development of smallholders is much more than just a question of how do we raise agriculture productivities of smallholders. I mean, the development of smallholders is also very closely entwined with economic development, with policies, with efforts of the government and the private sector. And the forms that these efforts take are also very much a reflection of the perceptions that they have and ideologies. So it's actually a very broad topic. So leaving it here, I would like to move on to the first presentation. I would just want to have a little one message for the people that are following the symposium online. So as I said, there's opportunity to ask questions. So if you're watching the symposium online and you want to participate in the question and answer session, you can click on the video and then watch on YouTube icon and in the left-hand bottom corner. And there will be, that will take you to YouTube, and there will be a chat box at the right hand, and there you can ask, you can put in comments and you can ask questions. And we have someone monitoring the chat box as we're having the discussion. So the first speaker, it's Phillipe Burger, Professor Phillipe Burger. So he's the Pro Vice-Chancellor, Poverty, Inequality and Economic Development. So Phillipe, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to not be speaking to dots on a screen. So it's wonderful to be here and to speak to actual people that I can see and that I can interact with. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Linus, I think we got the wrong presentation here. Let me just... Where's the, no, oh, there's the mouse. Where's the,
yes, no, that's not yours.
No, I didn't get it back. There we go. Great. Now we're up and running. So colleagues, yes, so I want to talk today, so when we talk about smallholder farming in South Africa, a large part of that happens in what was previously known as the Apartheid Bantustans. And I want to talk a bit about that because I think that is one part of this country that is largely forgotten when we talk about economic policy and social policy and everything that goes with that. And the one reason, or the one reason why this is very important is that almost 30% of South Africa's population still live in what were known as the Bantustans under the apartheid regime. So let's just take a bit of a historical walk back and see where all of this comes from. So in the apartheid era, the apartheid labor system basically had 3 very key components to it. The first one was a system in the labor market with job reservation. So good jobs were reserved for whites, low-skilled and semi-skilled jobs were left for black people. Together with that was the notorious, what was known as Ubuntu education system, where people like Hendrik Verwoerd said that, you know, it's not necessary to teach black kids mathematics. And if you want to read about that, you know, there's a whole lot of that. And that was to, you know, that was the feeding ground into the labor market. And the third component was a system of the Bantustans, which was basically a labor reserve system, linked with an influx control system to regulate numbers to cities. And yes, the first democratic government was supposed to change all of that. We abolished the Bantustans, we created labor legislation, modern labor legislation, and we created a non-racial education system. But my question today is, how much really changed? And in a particular, today I'm focusing on the old Bantustan areas. And as you'll see, what I'm going to argue is not a lot has changed. And it's almost 3 decades after apartheid, and the question is, when are we going to see real change there? Now, when we talk about land reform in South Africa, you know, we're all aware of the skewed racial profile of commercial land. We know about the tenure rights, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a minute, particularly tenure rights in communal land areas under traditional leadership. But when we talk about land reform, there are 3 components. The first would be land redistribution. The second would be land restitution. And the third would be tenure right reform. Now, I'm going to focus on the third component, tenure right reform, because that is what we see in the ex-homelands or ex-Bantustan areas. And specifically, I'm going to focus on tenure right reform on land under traditional leadership, and how that should tie into sustainable agriculture and the creation of livelihoods on such lands. Now, when you look at that map, that's the map of traditional land in South Africa. So all the bluish, greenish colors that you see there, that's land, traditional land in South Africa. When you overlay that with the map of the old Bantustans, you see it's virtually the same map. Okay? So that is where we have basically the traditional land. It's also some of the poorest land in South Africa. And I'm just going to show you another map. You see virtually the same patterns, but that is schools with bucket systems. Okay, so you always hear in education people talk about there's about 3,000 schools that still have bucket systems. A quarter of only have bucket systems, and a quarter of schools that have, you know, bucket systems solely or, you know, in addition to other ablution facilities. But you can see, and this is a signature of poverty for me, is that you see these overlays that still, and as I said, this is like 30 years after apartheid, and we still have schools with bucket systems. 3 decades. Okay, there you see in the 2011 census, which was the last census we had, and we're going to have another one very soon in this year. But according to that census, it was about 32% of the population were living on traditional land. Now, and of course, it's slightly changed because we have half a percentage point of the population urbanizing every year. So that would bring us, you know, 10 years later to about 28-29% of the population still live on traditional land. So it's still quite a large number of people in the land. Okay, so yes, the first point there is what I've already mentioned. In terms of showing communal land, it's virtually the same as the old Bantustan areas. You know, the Transkais, the Ciskais, the Bophuthatswanas, the Vendas, that we know at that time. But that land is still mostly it's still trust land, formally belonging to government, but it's trust land basically managed by traditional leaders. The exception would be the Ingonyama trust land, that is virtually the old KwaZulu homeland in KZN, with the Zulu king as only trustee. Now we'll see how with the new king, how that is going to work, but there's still a bit of a Game of Thrones playing out to see who's the new king. But we'll see what happens there. Okay, so let's dive into a few of the numbers. Now, according to the 2011 census, there were 16.5 million people who lived in traditional areas. 9.5 million of those people were of working age. Okay, but only 1.8 million of them were employed in an income-generating job. That's less than 1 in 5. Now, there were also 1.8 million subsistence farmers in the country, and there's a bit of an overlap between those two numbers, so that if we say subsistence farming also creates a living condition for you, you create a livelihood for yourself. It might not be generating income, but it is a form of work. If we include that together with the people who actually work and take care of the overlap between them, then we talked about 3.1 million people. It's still less than 30% of the working age population. There were, at that time, and I'm going to show you the new figures in a minute, also 4.6 million people whose daily job was fetching water and wood. Okay, and now that's not next door. These people have to walk kilometers every day to fetch this. So there you can see some of the, comparing 2011 with 2021, and where there were 1.8 million subsistence farmers, there's now about 2.3 million. But people fetching water increased from 4 to almost 5 million people. And what is, if you look at, so that all of that adds up to about 5 million people in 2011, about 6.2 million people in 2021. And if you do a further breakdown below in terms of who are employed in income-generating jobs, there is 1.1 million of those 5 million people at income-generating jobs, 1.3 million, or almost 1.4 of the 6.2 million now. But what is really disturbing is if you look at the number of unemployed, which increased from 500,000 to 1.5 million. Okay, so you can see that their reliance on the subsistence farming is quite significant. And of course, we also have a very fluid definition of subsistence farming. So very often somebody would be, if it's a bad year, the person is a subsistence farmer because what they grow is what they eat. If it's a good year, they generate a bit of a surplus over and above of what they self-eat, and then they're a commercial farmer for that year. So it's a bit of a fluid definition depending on the climate, etc. But what I'm saying is that living conditions in the former homelands are lagging far behind those of cities. Now, Thabo Mbeki used to say that we are two nations in one, but I'm arguing that there's actually three. I think there are the rich and the poor in the cities, and then there are the even poorer in these deep, what is euphemistically called deep rural areas, but it's basically the old homelands or the old Bantustans. And the ones that are really benefiting there, you will see what I'm arguing is that it's basically traditional leaders. So what is the core of the problem? I think the core of the problem is the lack of tenure rights. So people live on land, work on the land, but they do not have tenure security really on this land. They cannot use tenure rights to leverage themselves to a better financial position. You have nothing to take to a bank. Somebody who owns a private farm, you have collateral. Or even if you lease a farm, there's a stream of income that you can take to the bank and use as the collateral to secure finance. But that is not the case if you live on a piece of traditional land. And the issue is important. We talked about land rights and land reform, in the last 2 or 3 years, but in Article 25 or Section 25 of the Constitution, but there's one section that does not really get a lot of attention. That's Section 6 or subsection 6, which, and I'm going to read it, it says, a person or community whose tenure of land is legally insecure as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled to the extent provided by an act of parliament, either to tenure which is legally secure or to comparable redress. That's what the Constitution says. And it is the only article in the Constitution where there's another article saying that that article is important. Okay, so Article 9 says that Article 6, or Article 6 is important. Now, I thought every article in the Constitution is important, but if you have another article saying that this article is important, then you need to know that the constitutional, fathers and mothers really thought that this is an important issue. So, but what's the case? Well, we got sort of a half-baked measure called the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act of 1996. Now, look at that. It says Interim Protection of Informal Land. What is it? Is it 26 years later? It's still interim, because every year on the 20th of December, the Minister of Land signs its renewal for another year. We just are not able to get to something permanently. So we tried, but there's a sting. So there were two pieces of legislation. The one is called the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework, which empowered the chiefs. It says, for instance, that the chief needs a council, and half of the council needs to be elected. And I think there's a certain percentage that need to be females, etc. When you go and have a look at these councils, there, people who need to be elected are not elected. The number of females there is just not there. So actually, these councils are, against the Constitution, but or against the Act. But nevertheless, they are in operation almost 20 years later. And the traditional leaders still have strong control. Then you have the Communal Land Rights Act of 2004. And this act, there was an earlier version of it that existed before the 2004 election. And that year, there were negotiations, and then there was also at that stage the Inkatha Freedom Party was still ruling KZN, and then just before that election, the draft legislation was changed to empower the chiefs, and in that election, these chiefs, and there's actually scientific work by Daniel de Cat that shows that these chiefs recommended to the people in their land to vote for the ANC. In that election, it went from IFP to ANC. And it hasn't really changed. There was you'll all remember the report that Kgalema Motlanthe compiled saying that the Ingonyama Trust needs to disband. And the king actually wanted to secede from South Africa in reaction to that. And one of the first things that President Ramaphosa did in 2018, when he became president, was to visit the king to, keep the peace. But that Communal Land Right Act was actually struck down by the Constitutional Court. It was declared unconstitutional on procedural grounds. So now we have version 2 of all of these things. So Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act has been replaced by the Traditional Khoisan Leadership Act of 2019. And there is another attempt at the Communal Land Tenure Bill, but that thing is still not law. It's still stuck in Parliament. But it tries to do the same thing, keep the power with the chiefs. There's other legislation too that tries to empower the chiefs, like the Traditional Courts Bill, the Restitution of Land Rights Amendment Act, which was also declared unconstitutional. So yeah. Now the interesting thing is, why does all of this legislation run into trouble? Well, it's because Chapter 12 of the Constitution says that there should be a role for traditional leaders, but it doesn't say that they should have power. They are not a fourth tier of government. Okay. This is a democracy. Our government should be elected. It's not traditional leadership. Now, but what do we have? This entrenchment of traditional leadership. Well, I want to quote Governor Mbeki, who wrote the seminal piece in 1964. So President Mbeki's father, he's one of the Rivonia trialists, was also in prison for 26 years. he wrote in The Peasant Revolt, if ever you get the chance, read it. It's riveting reading, even more, almost, 60 years after. But and I'm going to quote him, he says, "The Bantu homelands have no cities, no industries, and few sources of employment. They are congested and permanently distressed areas where the inhabitants live on a narrow ledge of starvation. They are areas drained of their menfolk, for their chief exporters labor. And while the men work on white-owned farms and mines in industry, their womenfolk and old people pursue a primitive agricultural incapable of providing even subsistence. The homelands are mere reserves of labor with a population not even self-sustaining." Now, I think almost 60 years later, it's not much different if we look at the data that I presented earlier. Now, what options exist? How do we solve this? Now, in the literature, there are basically three solutions. The one is individual titling of land. So we divvy up the land and say, this piece belongs to you, that piece belongs to you. We create private ownership. Brian Cantor, for instance, makes that argument for South Africa. As you see, I don't agree with that. I'll explain to you in a minute why. Then there's a combination of communal ownership and small-scale farming. And thirdly, there's a combination of communal ownership and commercial large-scale farming. Now, I'm going to focus on the first two, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. Individual titling is the big a seminal book written on this is more than 2 decades ago, was Hernandez de Soto's Mystery of Capital, in which he argues that in developing countries, the problem is not too little capital, it is that the capital doesn't have ownership titled to it. Okay? If only we were to award ownership, people can use the land to get collateral and improve living conditions for themselves. So that is the argument but I'm arguing that is not the problem, or not the solution, rather. Here's what we have on a lot of traditional land. Someone harvests maize on a piece of land. When the maize is harvested, somebody else's cows graze there. And various families collect water, wood, food from the land. It means that we have overlapping use rights on the land. So now property rights is an exclusive thing. If this is my land, it's my land. It's not your land. So how do you deal with overlapping use rights? So, and then very often, remember, we have lots of systems of patriarchy still ruling the land. Most of these chiefs are male. Even though over 50% of households are female-headed compared to 34% in cities, it's still a very patriarchal society. So if this land is to be divided up, the people who would be disenfranchised, the people who would be disempowered are probably going to be women. So we need to find another way. And I think that the second option that I talked about might be one way to look at. And it is a system, a two-tier system of titling. So on the first tier, yes, you have communal land. Okay? It is this community, it's the Bafokeng, it's the Bafokeng's land. It is the Barolong, it's the Barolong's land. But then on a second tier, these use rights need to be recognized in law. So if you have the right to plant your maize here or to let your cattle graze there, then that should be secure in law. And why am I saying that? Well, if you have a secure title to that land and it's not vested in an interim protection that it needs to be, renewed year after year, if you have proper secure tenure right on your piece of land, then you can go to a developmental finance institution and say, I have this piece of land. I need capital to improve my piece of land. Because what you can promise is the stream of income that you will grow on that land. That is then your source of security. The other thing that we need to look at is the development of small scale, for small scale farmers, is economic ecosystems. So a few years ago, we had also a seminar. It was the days before webinars. We had a seminar, and you know, and one of we had a small-scale farmer from KZN there, and he stood up and he said, "I can grow my maize, but how do I get it to the market? The road is bad. I don't have a truck, etc." So we need to create supply chains, both upstream and downstream. If I see a maize farmer in Bothaville with a big farm, the sort of discount they can get because they buy a lot of seed compared to what you get if you're a small-scale farmer, I mean, you can't compete. So we need, you know, sort of a co-op system to help with buying inputs. If you have a small piece of land, it might not justify buying a big tractor, and these things are extremely, cost millions these days. But maybe you can have somebody who owns a tractor who, you know, plows the land, etc., for various farmers. We need to, that sort of creation. And then downstream, you know, Pick and Pay would prefer to probably, or Woolies probably, to negotiate with one farmer, not 200 small farmers. So we need a mechanism where you have one channel marketing that can speak to these shops and market stuff on you know, farmers markets and vegetable markets. So those are some of the things that we need. You know, what is increasingly becoming hip to do is to have eco-friendly food. People are willing to pay a bit more for that. They're paying a premium for that. This might be an ideal option to market such things. But we also need to create things like extension services for such areas, etc. And I'm almost done. I think, so there's, what we also then need to do is the control over that land. We need to democratize control and put the power in the people who actually farm there and take it out of the hands of traditional leaders. It's going to be not popular, but we see a lot of these court cases, and you know, and the courts agree with the communities. Think of the Kolobeni case a few years ago, where you know the chief wanted to make a deal with a mine, and the minister was big in support of the mining, and the people took them to court and say, "You didn't consult us." And yeah. Well, you know, it's community associations and so on. So, so I think there's a lot of, and there's like, I think it's the last time I checked, there were like a couple of hundred of these cases of communities in conflict with their leaders. So, I think there's an important role here to put the power in the hands of the people who farm on these lands, and that does not deny the very important role of traditional leadership. But it's not a control role. It's not power over the production. So I want to conclude. I think, you know, 27, 28 years after apartheid, we have a lot of urbanization, but we still have almost a third or almost 30% of the population who live on traditional land. Half of all the discouraged work seekers in the land in South Africa live on traditional land. And income generating jobs is less than 2 out of 10 working age individuals. I think we need reform there. We need policy focus specifically on these areas, and not just make it the stepchild of policy and, you know, talk about it euphemistically as the, you know, deep rural areas. We need some serious reform. Thank you very much. Do you want first questions, or do we do at the end? How do you want to do?
Yes, if there's any kind of urgent question, clarification, yeah, we can take one. All right, there's one there.
Thank you. I just talk. Thank you so much. My apologies, I arrived late. I just want to know, the purpose of this is to discuss the future of the smallholding farming in South Africa. But hence I apologize first. I thought maybe the review that we have given, it maybe analyzed or touch on the current situation and also what is the future. So I just want to link between the two. Our apologies if I missed the literature.
No need to apologize. It's a very valid
Thank you so
question. So the reform that I'm talking about is about the future. So as I mentioned earlier, so the definition of a subsistence farmer is very often, how good the harvest is. And if we can empower people with, giving them secure tenure rights that allows them to get finance to improve the farming, so their harvest or, the cattle that they raise there, that we can get better output there, so that they can start to, so it moves from a livelihood to almost a livelihood plus approach. So living conditions can improve, that people can earn a form of surplus on what they produce. Then I think, we're making progress. There's another number, for instance, that's very interesting to me, is 45% of cattle in South Africa is on traditional land, but only 5% of cattle sold in the market originates from traditional land. Now I know cattle is a very important cultural plays a very important cultural role too, but if one can get a better relationship between the cultural role and the commercial role of cattle, and people can actually market their cattle and start earning income in a market on that cattle. We can commercialize, because at the moment you might have cattle, but how do you get it to the market, because the road is too bad, you don't have a truck to take them. So I think a combination of improvement of tenure rights that gives the people on the land the power, commercial power to do with their land as they see fit, and they have it secure, together with the building of an ecosystem, a commercial ecosystem with upstream and downstream components, that upstream to make the input costs lower, and downstream to get better prices and get stuff to the market. Then you can start lifting living conditions on this land, and start to improve the living conditions of people there. And, you might even, at the moment, so here's another interesting number that you'll see in that census number, and I think it will, if we do the new census this year, it will be even worse. In 2011, for every 10 people in urban areas, there were 8 people in rural areas of age 30. Of 30-year-olds, for every 10 in an urban area were 8, no, sorry, I'm talking nonsense, 17-year-olds. For 17-year-olds, for every 10 in urban areas, there were 8 people in traditional areas. For age 30, it was for every 10 in urban, only 3 in traditional areas. So people in their 20s migrate to the cities. But if you start improving living conditions there, you can also alleviate maybe some of the pressure on the cities.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Philip. Yeah. Can we, do you mind if we move on with the presentations now? And you can keep your question when we get to the general debate at the end of the 3 presentations. Is that okay? You'll certainly will give you an opportunity. Yes, right.
Is it possible to get the computer sound off?
Yes, no, this is the problem. This is the problem. Okay, no. Yeah, well, thanks again, Philip. I mean, I think some of these numbers that you showed are really, well, I can say sobering numbers or shocking numbers, but it gives a lot of, food for thought. So the next speaker is Professor Ken Giller. Well, Ken Giller and I, we used to work together when I was still working in Wageningen in the Netherlands. So he is the chair of the Plant Production Systems Group at Wageningen University. And I mean, Ken, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Linus, and thanks for the invitation to speak here today. As Philippe said, it's wonderful to be speaking with people in the room for a change, instead of just speaking to a blank screen and hoping that somebody's out there listening. But I hope there are also maybe some people listening on the live stream as well. I'm not going to talk about South Africa. I'm going to talk about our work in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think as I go through the talk, I think you'll understand that there's a lot of resonance between what I'll be talking about and what Philippe's been talking about, but a different context. And I use this title of Stepping Up, Stepping Out and Hanging In to think about the aspirations and the trajectories, if you like, of people in rural communities might be taking in the future, thinking then about smallholder farming in sub-Saharan Africa. And I frame my talk very much around the Sustainable Development Goals. Our work really focuses in this SDG 2, which is really about ending hunger, food security, improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. Now, as I start then, I want to start big. And we did a report for the United Nations Food Systems Summit. I acknowledge my colleague Gerry van der Ven, who's here, who's one of the authors there. And if you look at projected population changes, you'll see that the world is going to be dominated by Africa in future. There'll be something by the end of the century, there'll be something like 4.5 billion Africans. It'll be equivalent to the whole of East and Southern Asia. Yeah? And actually by 2030, when we should achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we're moving in fact, to an extra billion people in Africa, in the African continent. So while population is stabilizing or reducing in other parts of the world, population continues to increase in Africa. And this is, in a sense, something of the challenge, but it's also maybe the opportunity, we could argue. Crop yields remain low in Africa. If you look at this rather complicated graph, you start at the bottom at where it says 100, that was what basically the cereal yield was in 1961. And you'll see that yields on the left in grey and in green have increased in Europe and North America enormously compared to 1961, with a decrease in the area under agriculture. Latin America, there's been a big increase in land area and a big increase in yield. Africa, yields have increased, but not very much. And there's been a massive expansion of the land under agriculture in Africa. So there's this urgent need to increase production, and potentially that's the opportunity, we could argue, for smallholder farmers. Now, I'm not an economist, but I will be talking about production resources. And the simplest form of economics, I think, around farming is that, well, farming depends on labor, land, and, of course, capital. I don't think many people in the audience would disagree with me on this. Now, if we take basically land and capital, and we look at different farming systems across the world, so here we have land area on the bottom axis, we've got capital on the vertical axis, we can see different trends that are happening, and this is from a review that we wrote with authors from all around the world. In countries like Australia, we see a massive expansion of the farm sizes, where there's a lot of capital and there's a lot of land. And I'll show you one picture of that later. In Europe, in the Netherlands where I live, there's intensification on very small areas of land, but with very high economic return. And we think here about glasshouse horticulture, where you can actually earn a massive amount of money from less than a hectare of land. But down in the bottom there in sub-Saharan Africa, we've got what we call marginalization in much of sub-Saharan Africa, as land areas decrease with subdivision over generations. So we're actually in an area of low capital, low land availability very often, and there's one arrow there with extensification. So in some parts of West Africa, where populations are still slightly lower, we still see expansion into new land as a form of extensification. But these are very opposite trends, and they differ very much dependent on the size of farm areas. And here's one slide from Australia, these massive zero-till planters where you actually have farms of something in the order of 10,000 hectares managed by 1 or 2 people. So they're not big employers, but these are very accurate planters. They plant your seed at 5 centimeters, they put the fertilizer, at 8 centimeters. You come back maybe once to control weeds, and then you harvest. So they can plant 500 hectares in a day. It's almost hard to comprehend. And then we've got the opposite, the smallholder systems in Africa. And this is a slide from work that I was doing together with Linus Franke, where we were looking at the promotion of grain legumes in Africa to put nitrogen fixation into soil to address soil fertility, but giving food and cash to farmers. And as part of that work, we realized that all of these wonderful technologies, and really these are wonderful legumes, they're great technologies, we can double, treble, quadruple yields on small areas. But they really weren't being taken up actively by many farmers. We were facing barriers there. And Linus did this analysis back in 2012, I think it's 10 years old, from 2 villages in Western Kenya. And I want to introduce this graph because I'll show you many graphs that look like this. So across the bottom axis for each place, we've got a percentage of the number of farms. So farms are lined up in terms of their production ability. So that's the harvested area on the vertical axis in this case. So the largest farms on the right, the smallest on the left. What you see in blue is the land that households of different size need to feed the family. And you'll see across on the right, there are farms which have got areas in green, which means that there's land there available for production, for the market as well, for commercial production. And on the left-hand side of the graphs, you'll see areas in the red, which are basically the extra land the household would need to be able to feed the family. So they don't have enough land to be self-sufficient with current production levels. And those were what we could call farm land gaps. And we would conclude from our work there that basically small farms and poor soils, and the soils often very depleted, are actually double poverty traps. Now that was the background for work that we've really built on. Here's another analysis taking household surveys from 93 sites in 17 countries across sub-Saharan Africa, where we're looking at 13,000 small farms. And this is where all of the income has been converted into food. It's a fairly strange metric, you can argue. But on the left, the food availability. So that's all income expressed as food, so that we can look at a food security threshold, which is 2,500 kilocalories per person per day. And you'll see here that 40% of households in Africa from these surveys are food insecure. If we move to the right of the graph, you'll see that as people, the green is the consumed crops. You'll see as people are actually getting more than they need to consume, they're selling cash crops. In orange, they're selling food crops, but then maize is often really a food and a cash crop. They're selling cash crops, they have more livestock, but particularly notice that they've also got a lot more off-farm income on the right than they do on the left. Now we've looked just recently, and this is a paper just published last year as part of our work for the UN Food Systems Summit together with IFAD. We've looked at small farm sizes and what are farm sizes from all the surveys we could find across Africa. And it's quite shocking, really, but our analysis is very different from what FAO will be telling you in terms of farm sizes. And this is all based on household survey. It's the LSMS, the World Bank surveys. It's supposed to be the gold standard. So I guess we should trust it. And you'll find there that many households are on farming on areas around 1 hectare or less. And the dominance of farming is on 2 hectares or less. Median farm size is much less in many, many locations. And we have locations here from West, East, and Southern Africa. And what we've done here is then looked at this sort of analysis that I showed you in the previous graph. So households ranked in wealth order across the bottom axis in terms of food self-sufficiency. And you'll see in this slide in northern Tanzania, in Mali, we see actually much more food self-sufficiency in Mali than other areas. This is a real surprise to us who work in agriculture, because that's a situation with 1 season per year with quite low rainfall relatively, whereas the East African highlands, the Ethiopian highlands, northern Tanzania, have 2 seasons a year, much better soils, much better agroecology for crop production, but much poorer food security simply because of the pressure on land and the lack of land for farm households. Now, of course, we've known how to close some of these yield gaps for a long time. This is a slide I took in the 1990s, actually, in Zimbabwe, where I worked extensively. I was professor of soil science in Zimbabwe for a number of years. And here we can see yellow maize, the typical maize we'd see in smallholder areas, and we see maize with fertilizer. So we've got the technologies to close yield gaps. And here, this is a graph, again a bit complicated, but the same locations of what happens if we close yield gaps. And we do this progressively from the grey is current yields, the orange then is 50% of the highest farmer's yield, the orange is the highest farmer's yield, and then the blue is really what we think would be the maximum you can attain locally. And you'll see it's only in Mali that we get to 100%, that even with closing yield gaps, we're not all households are not reaching food self-sufficiency. In many cases, we're going above 50%, but not all households, even if we do the very best with agriculture on those small areas of land. Now, of course, Phillipe was talking about subsistence farmers. It's not a term I like. I've never met a farmer who just wanted to subsist. I think every farmer wants their children to go to school. They want something better in the future. They want to be commercial. They want to sell things. And this is then a new statistic we're using, a living income. It's something which is really becoming very dominant in the literature now. So it's going beyond thinking about the poverty line to think about the basic human rights, the human right to food, the human right to housing, the human right to healthcare and education, and then a little margin on top. And this is from a paper that my colleague Gerry led. So it's a net income for a decent form of living, something that people might aspire to, higher than the poverty line. And we look at the same sets of data, but now around SDG 1, the zero poverty SDG, and the total value of activities in the vertical axis, and then the households ranked there, how many can actually get above the poverty line, how many above the living income line. And you'll see it's only again in Mali, in Uganda, that we have a substantial proportion of the households above the living income line. In fact, in these good agroecologies in Ethiopia and northern Tanzania, very, very few households above the poverty line. Same for central Malawi there. And we can do the same in terms of closing yield gaps. What does closing yield gaps do in terms of raising the percentage of households against these thresholds? And you'll see we've got very, very few households above the poverty line in any of the countries. Only in Uganda and Mali do we see a large proportion. In Uganda, 2 seasons a year, good agroecologies, perennial crops of highland banana, so much larger farms. In Mali, basically much larger farms, and cotton actually is a cash crop, which is driving incomes there. And then, in relation to the living income line, of course, even fewer households getting towards those thresholds. Now, I want us to take a step back and think about this idea I used in the title of hanging in, stepping up, and stepping out. And this is work from 2009 from my colleague Andrew Dorwood, who was a great mentor to me. And he's talking here about farmers who are basically hanging in. They're just trying to maintain and protect their current situation in terms of their wealth and their welfare. We've got farmers who are stepping up. They're investing in assets so they can increase their scale, they can increase their productivity. And we've got the strategy of stepping out. So choosing to accumulate enough assets so you can step out and go to employment elsewhere. And I think when we talk about accumulating assets there, we have to include education as a route, of course, to better jobs and better employment elsewhere. And I think this is a very interesting framing. And if we look, though, at our analysis here, actually, we find 80 to 90% of our households are really in that area that we think are hanging in. They're below the poverty line. In between, we've got a very, very small margin of households. Basically, that's in between the poverty line and the living income line. And above the living income line, well, you could argue maybe they've already stepped up. Those are the households in rural areas who are already getting a living income, but it's a very small fraction of the households. Now, we turned this around a bit and we said, well, okay, how much land would you need? And this is for one area in northern Tanzania. It's basically, it's the second column there, site, northern Tanzania, the area around Lushoto. I actually had my first work in Africa in Lushoto in the mid-1980s, so I've been working in Africa close to 40 years now across all different regions. And this is basically saying if you have baseline yields, the median area you would need would be at least 1.5 hectares, so that's B1 there, scenario, to reach the poverty line, to reach the living income line, to reach the poverty line in grey, you would need about a hectare. If you actually include costs, of course, you need even more area than that. So we're thinking to get to the poverty line, you'd need about 2 hectares. And that's in an area where you've got 2 seasons per year, very good agroecology. But then, of course, you can reach these thresholds if you have improved yields. That helps a lot. Profitable crops, of course, you don't need so much area. And off-farm income, well, of course, then you're balancing your income in diverse sources. And we find, in fact, that very, very many households have got multiple sources of income. It's not just one farmer doing, or everybody working on the farm. It's different people working outside the farm, as well as people working on the farm. And I think actually we see that for farming across the world. So with that B2 scenario in Lesotho, we find currently only 4% of the households have enough land to actually reach the living income line under that B2 scenario. So another example here from work we were doing in southern Ethiopia as an example. These are beautiful home garden systems. They're traditional systems of Enset, the false banana, which is grown in multi-story agroforestry with different trees and coffee and food crops. So very much a sort of agroecological paradise in many ways, these traditional home gardens. What do we find? This household that we visited, the farmer has, that's his family. On the left is a neighbor, but he and his wife and their 5 children. They live on 0.2 hectares. They've gone basically over to monoculture of Catha edulis, which is basically a narcotic. It's flown out to the Middle East. It has harvested and goes straight off to the city and straight out by plane. Has to be consumed within 24 hours. But he can make a living income from 0.2 hectares, but not from growing food security crops. He simply goes to the market to buy the food. We went there to this area with a whole group of PhD students, 32 students, a whole load of staff. We spent 2 weeks analyzing the system. We arrived, students said, this is terrible. All these people growing the narcotics, they shouldn't be doing this. They should be growing food crops. As we left, everybody said, if I was a farmer here, I'd be growing narcotics, because it's the only way you can afford to send your children to school. A real turnaround in terms of thinking for them. And I came up then with this idea of a food security conundrum. So national food security in Africa, it needs an abundant supply of cheap and nutritious food for both the rural and the urban populations. This is a policy goal to be food self-sufficient at national level for nearly every country in Africa. Agriculture is also a major contributor to the balance of payments for African economies. And that agriculture for export attracts far more interest from governments, actually, than support for smallholders does. And against that backdrop, you've got rural households, who I'd call reluctant farmers, and they lack sufficient land or economic incentives to invest in agriculture. And that leaves us, if you like, with this conundrum, that there's this huge yield gap, but how do we fill it if it's not going to be economically worthwhile for those individual families to work to fill that yield gap? It's easier, the returns on their labor are far better to spend that labor off-farm than on-farm because of the lack of economies of scale. And this graph in the top left, the top graph, is the 2015 situation in terms of people per land area. And you'll see already per hectare in many countries, you've already got 12 to 25 people per hectare. Down below is a projection for 2050, looking at the situation of population if the area expands. So if we take more land into agriculture. But on the right, that's what would happen if land area doesn't expand, and you can see we'll end up with situations where more or less across Africa we might have 25 to 100 people per hectare of cropland, and that's simply not possible to support that population. So that's with current yields. So obviously there's this massive need to boost productivity, and particularly with the use of more nutrients, with fertilizers and everything else we could do. So what can we do on small farms? A bit more on a positive note. In the highlands of Rwanda, of course, you can intensify upwards. I've been walking through these beans, and the beans are way above my head, so up to 3 meters tall. We can take yields from really less than a ton up to 5 tons of beans per hectare. In West Africa, we can address human nutrition with these short duration cowpeas, which yield twice in one growing season. So we can address nutritional needs, but it's not paying the bills necessarily. In Malawi here, on the same area of land, simply by doubling up rows, you can actually double yields with just new varieties which are resistant to rosette virus, and by planting more densely. So we do have technologies that can improve production under these situations. But at the end of the day, it's really not going to address this issue of neither hunger nor poverty directly. Now, my main messages, though, would be we have to keep a continuous focus on production in Africa, because producing outside and simply importing food is not going to be the long-term solution. So we know that agricultural development has proven to be very effective in reducing poverty and hunger for the poorest households. So that has to be still a priority. But we question this assumption that agriculture is going to drive economic development. Due to land fragmentation, due to low productivity, and due to the limited jobs and social security outside agriculture. And I think this is probably where the situation in South Africa really comes in. I think the problems in rural areas are not just problems of agriculture. There are problems of a lack of jobs outside agriculture, both in those rural areas and in the cities. And that really needs a drastic rethink of policies to actually connect the cities with rural areas more if we're going to achieve SDG 2. And I think there's a lot of similarity here of what we see in other parts of Africa with what we see in South Africa. Now, on a broader scale, I really would argue that to transform our food system, we're talking now in all of our science around food systems, but we can't see the food system isolated from the broader economic system. There are huge differences between farms in terms of economies of scale, access to markets, and yet farmers compete for the same prices in global markets. And we need to actually do regulation around that if we're going to stimulate the ability for smallholders to compete. And I think that there's then action needed to rethink the future of farming to fulfill both this global need of nutritious diets for all, and at the same time to provide appealing livelihoods for farmers. And with that, I'd like to thank a number of co-authors, including my colleagues here, Gerry van der Ven and Linus Franke from the past. And I'd just leave you with this one advertising slide, which is a debating forum that we're promoting from Wageningen, where we're working together with Oxford and the Swedish University to try and get more debate engaged around these topics. So thanks very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Ken. Just a little reminder for those that are following this symposium online. So if you want to participate in the question and answer session, you can click on the video and then on watch on YouTube icon in the left-hand bottom corner. So that will take you to YouTube, and there you will see a chat box on the right-hand side where you can put in comments and ask questions. So, is there someone who would like to ask a question or a clarification? Okay.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. First of all, I don't know whether from the first speaker, I don't know what to say, whether it's a comment or it's a question. You've mentioned very well, you did articulate with regard to the issue of the absorption of the broken labor systems from the previous government to this one that we're currently having now. That is so true. But now the problem that we are having, even now, we don't have clear policies or ideas in terms of how can we rectify that. That's one of the issues that we are facing now in the country, and it's becoming a problem. What I don't agree with you is the issue of, I will say, the communalization of the communal areas. I believe now the policies that we have in terms of land in South Africa, they're quite correct with regard to that. What I'm saying that is because the more you become commercializing the former TVV states, communal areas, that means you're opening brackets, opportunities for the sharks like the land bank, the banks, particularly the communalization in that area. So I believe that the government is trying by all means to protect those farmers in those areas, to make sure that the land is not taken away from that. Because the more you give land to these banks, is the more you're opening, the loss of land that we need so much in South Africa. Particularly that the land itself now currently is not well in terms of being divided within the communal areas. Because with that one, it also goes back to the issue of saying, if we continue not assisting our farmers with regard to that will be a problem. To the second speaker, I have a question with regard to the issue of saying that production should be increased in South Africa, particularly in these communal areas. How can that be done if majority of the people around Africa are flocking to South Africa itself, and we have not enough resources? And secondly, how can that be done since we are all majority of countries in Africa are faced with a serious civil wars due to the foreign countries? Thank you.
So the first question was addressed to Philip.
Well, I'm not going to take the second speaker's time.
No, maybe you want to address that question when we get to the general discussion.
Okay.
So the question about increasing productivity.
Sure. I mean, obviously, there's no point in increasing productivity unless there's a market for the produce. But given that, I mean, farmers want to produce, and they want to produce for a market. And obviously, to be able to do that, and in a sense, I can't really comment too much on South Africa. I don't know the country well enough, although we're working together with Prof Franke and with Neo here in a couple of the communal areas now. But I mean, I think that there's no point in continuing, if you like, trying to scratch food production and living out at the yields there are now, because that's simply a demeaning use of the individual's labor. And I think it goes back very much to the previous speaker, what Philippe was saying, that unless there are good input supply chains, that the farmers can get access to good inputs and they have good markets to offset their produce, there's really not much sense in them continuing to produce. I mean, they're better to, I guess, take their grants and go to the supermarket and buy food there, because that would be more economic than their activity currently. People often ask me, what's the one thing you have to do to stimulate smallholder agriculture? And it's not one thing, it's better infrastructure. So better roads access, it's better inputs, it's better markets, it's better technologies, it's a whole lot together. And unfortunately, so far, what we've seen when we've been out looking at these different areas is very few of those necessities, prerequisites are there in place. And I would very much support the one point that Philippe was making, particularly about this idea of title and communal rights. And I think that's true in other parts of Africa. We see if people are given title, they often lose their land almost straight away, because they borrow money against that land from the banks as collateral, and then the banks come back and they take the land, if you like. Or they sell their land to wealthier people locally because they can't afford to hold on, and then they have nowhere to live, yeah? And then they end up being pushed into the cities. I don't want to comment about the migration into South Africa. I think that's not so much actually, I don't think those people are migrating into the communal areas particularly. I think they're migrating here because even though there's a big problem of unemployment in South Africa, there are bigger problems of unemployment in other countries, and people see it as actually a very good place to come in terms of options for work. And that is going to be increasingly a problem if you look at the demographic changes that we're facing in Africa. I probably ought to stop at that point. We come back to the general discussion later, I guess. So,
Yes, yes, we will.
thanks very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so now we have our third and final speaker, Dr. Qinisani Qwabe. Qinisani works at he's a lecturer at the Department of Sustainable Food Systems and Development here at the University of the Free State. And well, we've heard already quite a bit about commercializing smallholders and opportunities, or how many of them are actually able to commercialize. So he will talk a bit more about that with his experience around small-scale commercial farming. Qinisani, please go ahead.
My students say I talk a lot. So for the purpose of this symposium, I will try and keep to my height and be short, because I'm short. Before I formally introduce myself, I feel a need to provide context about my talk. And to do this, I will borrow from the words of Professor Johan Kirsten and Mr. Wandile Sihlobo, who said, and I quote, "Our plans and ideas within the agricultural fraternity are often confused by the concepts scale and commercial. This is an unintended notion that commercial farming can only be large and capital-intensive agriculture. The truth, however, is that small farmers can be commercial at a relatively small scale, of course." Now, to introduce myself, good morning to everyone in the house. My name is Qinisani Qwabe, and as Prof has mentioned, I come from the Department of Sustainable Food Systems and Development here at the University of the Free State. By training, I am an extensionist. I like to call myself an enabler of innovation and development in areas where there is a lack, particularly when you speak about food. So these would mostly be in rural areas where we get a lot of smallholder farmers that we are talking about today. In our South African context, so it means that my work outside the boundaries of academia, I am involved with a lot of farmers who mostly operate at a small scale, farmers who grow food for household consumption, what we normally refer to as subsistence farming, as Prof Phillipe mentioned earlier, and farmers who either grow for profit or for both household consumption and to make profit at the end of the day. Now, the reason why I started by quoting Professor Jansen and Mr. Sihlobo on the use of concepts is because during the preparation of this talk, I had a conversation with a couple of farmers in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. Farmers who believe that they have established themselves well enough not to be called emerging farmers. Hence, if you look at my topic, at my title, the term emerging has been cancelled out. If I were to quote this gentleman on screen, Mr. Snelizwi Fagade, the term is condescending and it is undermining to farmers. In his words, when I talk to him telephonically, he says to me, "It feels like you are talking about another lost child, a by the way kind of a thing." So I then ask, what would be an alternative? And his response was, use developing farmers. And at the back of my mind, I'm already thinking, why developing farmers? Are they not operating at a small scale? I was thinking that, but I was actually uttering it out loud. So he says, yes, it doesn't take away the fact that they are operating at a small scale. To cut the long story short, we both reach a point where we reach an agreement that based on scale and turnover as a measure, using both scale and turnover as a measure, it is befitting to refer to these so-called emerging farmers as small-scale commercial farmers because they actively participate in the market environment. Oftentimes, these farmers would be small but experienced farmers who are brought up in communities that practice agriculture as a means of earning a sustainable livelihood. Communities where farming knowledge is passed down from generation to the next. By the way, if you look there on, I think that's bottom right or bottom left, depending where you're sitting, that's me and my grandmother, and she was teaching me how to grow cucumbers. So it shows, by the way, that farmers, she's in very deep rural areas, farmers do know how to produce food for themselves, but because of certain challenges, which I'm still going to talk about, there are limitations which hinder them from expanding, especially when you speak in the context of rural farming. So communities where farming is, where knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. If you check the recent reports by Statistics South Africa, you learn that most hunger-stricken communities in the country are not necessarily those in rural areas, especially if you look back from the time when COVID started. You would see that it's mostly your urban and township areas. Why is this? I ask myself. And the probable answer is because farmers in former homelands, in rural areas, they have the means to produce enough for household consumption, while some do so to make profit. And it is near impossible in the so-called developed parts of the country. I stayed in Durban. The picture above my grandmother and I tried growing some stuff. I could not because there was just no space. I know there is what we call urban farming today, but it is not as practical as many of us would like to think, at least not for most people. Many farmers, however, small-scale commercial farmers in particular, usually face a myriad of challenges which prevent them from transitioning into what I will refer to as fully fledged commercial farmers or large-scale commercial farmers, if you like. Some of these challenges include poor infrastructure, lack of capital, which, by the way, tends to hinder farmers from operating at a maximum scale. So I'm going to make an example with Sipesihle here. She is from Umtata. She mentions during our telephonic conversation that for quite some time she had access to 85 hectares of land, but could only utilize 15 hectares. And the reasons for this are because of water restrictions. She has to get licenses. She has to get a license for the water that she uses. And for her, it is not affordable because she's self-funded and she's still a small-scale farmer. Secondly, operational costs for her were a problem. And I would assume this would be a reality for most farmers. Thirdly, access to markets was a challenge, partly because of the poor developed roads in the area. And lastly, This one for me is a wow. Discrimination based on gender. She is female. So she tells me that when she first approached SPAR, she was told that they don't make purchases from local farmers because they are inconsistent. She then goes back to that SPAR with her husband, stands outside. The husband goes in, negotiates with the very same person, and they have a deal. This is someone, Sipesihle, who would later be one of the main suppliers of Spar and Boxer supermarkets around Umtata and East London, by the way. Now, coming back home, here at the University of the Free State, in collaboration with Standard Bank, we've got a program called the Rafaram Project that is aimed at developing small-scale commercial farmers. And these are in the Free State, in different parts of the Free State. If I remember some areas, it would be Kroonstad, Bethlehem, and Bloemfontein. Most of these farmers are black. In fact, all of them are black. The program has been running for the past 3 years, and each year, numerous farmers would be recruited into the program. So the advantage of partaking in this program is that for the whole year, farmers are provided free training in different areas of farming. You can think of farm management, bookkeeping, soil science, sustainable production practices, drafting business proposals. There's many things that are covered during the program. At the end of the program, which is after 12 months, those farmers who are interested in funding would be required to come up with detailed business proposals, which would be received by Standard Bank. Standard Bank would then select suitable farmers that would be deserving to get support of not more than 100,000 rands, which is not much, which is also not small. And I have a reason for saying this, but we will cover that during the discussion. Most of these farmers, if not all of them, they have created job opportunities for other people, tens of people, meaning that they participate in the national economy. So I'm not sure about you, but for me, this is one of the most effective models that I have came across to date, especially looking at our South African context. And I believe that it can help to break the dependency syndrome that where farmers always expect to receive without making any efforts towards investing on sustaining themselves and expanding their production. It also allows farmers to take ownership in what they do, because they now understand that they now understand what their responsibility is and what it is that is at stake should they decide to drop their projects halfway. From the 70 farmers that we've had in the past 3 years who have been granted funding, the success rate currently stands at 96%. Meaning that 72 of them have been successful or are successful because they are still operating even today. Unfortunately, 2 of them passed and 1 just went MIA. I guess you would always expect that in a project of this nature. Prof Phillipe, I saw you are a fan, so this one is for you. President Ramaphosa. In his State of the Nation address last week, the president spoke about creating means of enabling opportunities that would stimulate economic growth. My take, if we talk about this in the context of agriculture in general and in empowering the previously disadvantaged groups in particular, Perhaps government could learn from this Standard Bank initiative. I know it's too early to draw conclusions about the program at this stage, but I do believe that it may be a winning concept that could be our big break if replicated well and implemented across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've been waiting for the speakers to talk about the taboo. I'm saying this because South Africa is not drought resistant, and I was waiting to hear the role of the genetic modified crops, or maybe genetic modified seeds. Towards the success of the smallholding farmers especially. But as I've said initially, that the issue of the drought is affecting everyone, and it's also affecting our food security. Thank you.
Okay. Is that my clan name, Malandel? Ngosibut. I did not know. I find this question, rather statement, open statement, very interesting, because yesterday when I was sitting with colleagues, we spoke about GMOs. You go to rural areas, you tell people to use genetically modified crops. These are people who mostly grow your indigenous vegetables, which occur naturally in those spaces. They don't need much water. They are climate resistant, if I may put it like that. And then you introduce genetically modified crops, spinach, for example. You are talking about drought. They would then ask you, how possible is it for me to grow spinach on a half a hectare space when I don't even have access to water? They would ask the same about broccoli or whatever GMO crop that exists out there. So for them, a strategy, a livelihood strategy, is mostly to use indigenous crops. Other people refer to them as traditional crops because they are resilient in those spaces. And this is in the context of rural communities, which I think you were asking about.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much, Qwabe, Qinisani. I just would like to ask the three speakers to come to the front, so we'll now come to the kind of a general discussion. And actually, first of all, I would like to give the microphone to Neo Mathinya. I think a lot of her PhD research closely relates to some of the things that we've discussed here. So I'd just like to ask her to give her first observations and questions.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to all the speakers. You have, to some extent, helped me answer the questions I've been struggling with in my own PhD work, so thank you for that. Prof Burger, to you first. You've mentioned a couple of problems I've encountered when I was doing the literature review. The first one being that we are not consistent with the terms that we use for small-scale farming. So some people say smallholder farmer, there's a small-scale farmer, there's a subsistence farmer, and there's, you name them. So from a scholarly perspective, when you want to do a literature review, you are sort of stuck. Do I include just the papers that say smallholder farmer? Do I include all the papers that mention the scale of farming, maybe 1 hectare and less, and so forth? But what I would like to comment on precisely with your talk is my preliminary results have showed me that people are actually cultivating less land than they have. So you find household with 1.5 hectares of land, but they're actually only cultivating 0.5. So the question really is, should we then be arguing for land redistribution when people are actually not using the land? Should we rather not be thinking about alternatives outside of agriculture and just leave the land issue alone? Particularly the land issue is very sensitive in the South African context. We don't want to talk about it. It causes a political stir, but it's something that needs to be addressed. So taking the policy considerations you've mentioned, I was just wondering, should we rather not reframe that in such a way that we move a little from putting all the pressure in agriculture and to looking for alternatives outside agriculture? And coming to you, Prof Giller.
Do you want to take the question first? It's probably good. You take the question.
Okay, I have actually quite a lot to say, so maybe I just finish my story and you guys can answer me as we go along. Coming to you, Prof Giller, you mentioned in your presentation, closing the yield gaps that we have does not actually put a lot of households above the poverty line. It doesn't bring them above the living income line. And some of my colleagues are sitting here today. They've done quite a lot of work at the field scale. So we know what to do at the field scale. If the crop needs more water, how can we help you with that? If you are rain-fed, if you are irrigation, we know all of that. So my question to you is, if closing the yield gaps does not bring the farmers above the poverty line, it doesn't bring them above the living income line, what can we, as academics and the rest of my colleagues, what can our contribution be? Because we already told the farmers, do water conservation, try, conservation agriculture, but clearly it's not, taking them a step further. So what do we do then? Do we just give up? And to you, Dr. Qwabe, with the regards to commercialization of small-scale farming, we are not calling them emerging farmers anymore. They are small-scale commercial farmers. All right. You've mentioned that they are facing a lot of challenges, obstacles that are preventing them to go large-scale or something along those lines. But the reality is the same challenges that they are facing, the commercial farmers on a large scale are also facing the same challenges. There was an article I read from 2018 by Herrickson and Malinga, and the title of the article says, "On the Other Side of the Ditch." So she was actually looking at farmers on the same bioregion. They were only separated by a fence or a ditch. So the same biophysical challenges you are finding on the left, you are also finding on the right. The same challenges of infrastructure, the same road that the small-scale farmer must travel is the same road that the commercial farmer must travel. So shouldn't we rather have a conversation where we are all in the same room and stop saying, smallholder farmers, these are their challenges, and forget the large-scale farmers and pretend as if they do not have any challenges they are facing. So maybe an open conversations allow us to say, large-scale farmers, what is it that you are doing that we are not doing as small-scale farmers? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
The smaller ones start.
You may start.
You have three challenging questions to answer. You would like to start?
I've requested to start because I'm the youngest. Sorry, sir. To close off my response to you, I do think genetically modified crops do have a potential role to play. They have a significant role to play in those communities. However, there are still those challenges that need to be addressed first. Now, to come back to you, you say small-scale farmers experience similar challenges as large-scale farmers. I had the answer when I was standing there. Now I don't know what happened. If I am making a profit of 20 million rands per annum, I don't think it's fair to make a comparison to somebody who is making 10,000 rands per annum. because it means they can make means of surviving. They are commercial, they are generating enough income. Well, that's not a fair thing to say, but it's true. They can always find other means of surviving. But when you bring that to me, a small-scale commercial farmer or somebody who is aspiring to be a small-scale commercial farmer, it may come as a limitation. If we take the example of roads, for example, or transport, if I don't have a bakkie, I cannot afford to always hire a bakkie all the time. Whereas the next farmer, the commercial farmer, has all the resources they might need in order to get to the market. So it's those kind of things that we are working on, if I may put it like that. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Can I follow that?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a very good answer, in my view. But to pick up on it, you know, one of the things, when we look across the world, I mean, obviously the economies of scale are there, although both the infrastructural and the biophysical environment there could be exactly the same, as you say. I think the economies of scale allow you to address and overcome some of those problems. You know, when we talk about these wheat farmers in Australia, they're often only getting 1 or 1.5 tons of wheat grain per hectare. So they're what we call very low yields, but they're in environments of only around 400 millimeters of rain, so it's highly water efficient for that rainfall. But they can make a profit because they're farming 10,000 hectares with wheat. Yeah? Whereas if you had only 1 hectare, it really wouldn't be a viable enterprise. So I think this idea of economies of scale is absolutely fundamental to this discussion. And I think the point that you raised, and actually that Dr. Qwabe raised, was actually key. Your tomato farmer, 85 hectares, only using 15 due to shortage of water and probably water plus other inputs. I mean, it shows very clearly that the issue is not only land. I mean, land is one of the issues, and we shouldn't duck away from that. But it's quite clear that a lot of the land is not being used productively, which could be used productively in those environments where it can be used. Where we were yesterday in Tabanchu, I mean, we do see, though, that there are people there potentially trying to grow crops in environments where it's really going to be challenging. They're going to be fairly marginal environments for cropping anyway. And you'd have to be an extremely skilled farmer to actually routinely get good crops out of that. Now, to pick up on the GMO side, I think GMOs, well, they're fine, but they're not a panacea. I mean, I think I'd have no reason to say why, you know, smallholders shouldn't use them. They can address, you know, they can be more drought tolerant, but they don't solve the problem of drought, I think. And clearly in South Africa, maybe not this year from what I've been seeing in terms of the flooding as we drive around, but in many years, water is a major constraint. And access to water in these I want to call them communal areas because I worked in Zimbabwe all the time. Do you call them communal areas here, or the small-scale farming areas? Access to water is going to be a huge issue as well as access to land. Because if people are going to be able to build a living off those very small areas, they need to do it then with high-value crops. And so they probably need to specialize into vegetable production and things. My final point would be, I'm an agronomist working very much as well at field scale as well at farm scale. But I do think as agronomists, we've tended to ignore the farm scale for far too long. We've tended to solve things on a plot scale and say, come on, farmer, why aren't you doing it? You must be stupid. You're not growing things properly, without recognizing the context and the constraints of farming. So it's not to say that we shouldn't do that sort of work, but we can't expect it to just happen like that if people face these other constraints. And I think Phillipe elaborated those very well. There are multiple constraints of infrastructure, inputs, outputs, the whole lot. And you need to get all of that right for farming to thrive. I pass the word. But good questions.
I almost want to say ditto, you know. But to come back to your question about, you know, should we rather focus on improving production on land, let's say communal land areas, or look at redistribution of land and so on. many of the problems that we encounter on both. So land that, most of the land, more than 90% of the land that has been restituted or redistributed. What happened is that, you know, you get a communal property association to run it, and you have 200 people who want to live on that land, and then nothing happens. And 3 years later, those 200 people, you know, 80% of them moved away again. And for the very same reason, they got the land, but they're not embedded in a supply chain. Many of them are not even trained farmers. So, you know, so it's one thing to get the land, but okay, what do you do with it? And there, I think we need to really think carefully. All these constraints, you know, capital constraints, skill constraints, infrastructure constraints, that's what causes us to, or causes a farmer to only, you know, plant something on 15 of the 85 hectares. And if we can get the supply chain, the ecosystem around that farmer right to make it profitable to expand to the other 70 hectares on the land, then we have a chance. But it will take, again, as I said earlier, it will take deliberate policy to decide or to do that. And I want to agree on the scale of production. You know, so two farmers can have precisely the same yield, but the one is not profitable because the input costs are prohibiting, or because the price they get in the market for that doesn't make it profitable. So scale is important, and there too I think we need to think carefully on different ways, you know, where you can, and that's the third option that I didn't have time to talk about. But how can you, so even if you restitute land or even on communal land, it should not be impossible to have large-scale farming. I know that, you know, for instance, the big tomato farmers in the country, ZZ2, they have an agreement with a community on communal land, where they farm with the people working there on the piece of communal land, and the profits, you know, so they get their profit share, but the profits largely go to the community. So it's operated as a big commercial farm on communal land area, and the people benefit more because it generates more income that comes to them, and they still live on the land. You know, so it's almost the best of various worlds. You will have different solutions to different pieces of land, so there's not a one-size-fits-all, but I do think we need to, you know, you talked about taboos earlier, you know, we need to overcome some of these taboos and to reconcile, you know, tradition and culture with commercial viability. And I like your comment earlier, not because I necessarily agree with it, but you know, so I do think we need to go the commercial route, but we can do so in a manner that protects people to a large extent. So that's why I was not in favor of the individual titling, because as you also rightly mentioned, you know, before you have a second take on it, the land is all in the hands of some local new property mogul. So we need to think about different ways to protect people, but to also, I think, commercialize it, because that will unlock it. I've seen, for instance, simple things like in Moketsi in Limpopo, where they opened up a vegetable market. So yes, the big farmers, you know, they bring their big interlink trucks and big load of onions or whatever they sell there. But the guy on a 1 hectare also sells his or her stuff. Or the, you know, if you have a female farmer, she sells her stuff there. And, you know, but because you created a market there, there's a place to bring the stuff. And the buyers, similarly, you have big buyers, big supermarkets and big shops buying them, but it ranges all the way to what they call these bucky traders and even smaller, vendors who buy a few bags of potatoes or whatever might be the case. So I think it's a case of explicit policy design. It is an explicit creation of the ecosystem with markets that suit the needs of the people.
Sorry, we have two questions online, and then we go to the back of the audience.
Right, the first question is for Dr. Qwabe. It's from Makala Romatsa. The person is asking if the program for Standard Bank is only for Free State farmers, or is it open to all farmers in South Africa? And then the other question is from Betty Masamba. It's for Professor Ken. I'm always confused when it comes to smallholder farmers and small-scale farmers. Are there differences between the two? And if so, when are we supposed to use each of them? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, the program is only limited to Free State for now, and we've got those 3 regions where we are currently operating from. So it's not to the entire South Africa, but I do know that Standard Bank offers assistance to individual farmers. So if anyone is interested in such programs, I think they can go at their own personal capacity to Standard Bank and then talk to agricultural advisors that are there, because they are always available to assist. Thanks.
Yeah, very, very quickly on the semantic question, I use the terms interchangeably. Maybe that's not correct, but I think for me, small scale, smallholder, it's the same. So thanks, Betty, for the question.
Okay, so there were 2 questions. Sorry, there were 2 questions here.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine, sir.
It's fine. No, it's not fine.
Cool. Just to contribute to Nao's question about why do some farmers excel, even it's the same biophysical area. And in my limited experience, we did surveys and interviews with farmers, and most farmers were far behind. There's a massive yield gap between what we should get and what they actually achieve. But there was one farmer who excelled. And the only difference was when we asked him about their occupation, the other farmers all said that they are unemployed. And when we asked that farmer, he looked at us like we were stupid, and he said he's a farmer. So I think the perception of the farmers about what they're doing is also important.
I think it's a really good comment, because of course I think that resonates with some of what I was saying about that people have multiple livelihood activities and they tend to invest in one or the other, and that can often mean that they're working for other farmers instead of doing everything at the right time, if you like, on their own farm. So that can interfere, if you like, with the agronomy. I think as well, we've had an awful lot of discussion about yield gaps recently. And of course, there's a biophysical maximum yield. But if we look around the world, these farmers on these huge areas in Australia are only getting 50% of the biophysically possible yield in a good year, because of course they hedge their bets in terms of climate risk. So they're pitching for something like 50% of the biophysically possible, because they know that not every year it's going to rain well. And so I think, when we're thinking about yield and yield gaps, we have to take into account risk and the economic benefits at the same time as just thinking about the biophysical limits. Because I think, and I'm looking also at myself here, we often fall into this trap of thinking everybody should be going, for the top, when really that doesn't make sense in terms of risk and economics. Yeah. But thanks for the point. It's an important one.
Okay. Yes,
thank you very much. My question is to Prof Phillipe. I agree with institutional challenges that you highlighted in terms of land tenure, security, etc. But towards the end, my problem is with your recommendations. Before I joined University of the Free State, I was at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I had some discussions, very interesting discussions with some of the traditional leaders. Now, as you know, there is a whole lot of, imagine some of the traditional leaders were here in this room while you were making those suggestions and recommendations. Now, I would like us at the policy level, how should we go about it really, given the various vested interests and various challenges in terms of making those kinds of recommendations, and given the fact that from my discussions and my recollection, it looks like they are, there is a very serious status quo bias. In other words, they prefer to maintain the status quo, and change is quite a challenge. Now, how do you deal with that at the policy level, considering that you know all the different difficulties that we all know will there be when you are making such a recommendation? Thank you very much.
There's no smooth way of doing it. You're not gonna just have a smooth discussion about it and then everybody buys in, because yes, there's a vested interest here. But look, so here's some of the stuff that we've seen happening. So in 2004, with that election, I mean, the work that Dan de Cat has done, they've shown that that there was quite a significant impact of the traditional leadership on people's voting patterns, people living in those areas. But I think it is slowly starting to change, and for two reasons. The first is that there's an urbanization. So people are voting with their feet. Okay, so they're moving out of there, and that will change the voting blocks, if I can put it, in future. But even the people who stay there, if you look at the last elections, particularly, and I'm not talking about KZN, because the traditional leadership, whether both the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party play for the favor of the chiefs, but in other parts of the country, if you look at where the economic freedom fighters most made a lot of gain, it is in traditional areas, and so they are exploiting that unhappiness that you have there amongst the people there, relative to the elite, who includes the chiefs. So I think you're starting to see some change in that. So how to approach this? It will be a tough reform process that I think will be difficult I think nationally, we are veering off a bit from the main point of discussion here, but the next decade will see South African politics moving increasingly into coalition politics and more fragmentation. And we've just seen it with the last 2-3 elections. And that will open up new avenues for new interest groups, like people living on the land, to express their interests and to bring them to the table. And so it's not going to be an easy one. It's not just, we create a piece. We actually tried that with the Communal Land Act. Initially, the first drafts put the power in the hands of the chiefs. Tokodidiza pushed that version of the legislation. But then she was overwritten, just before the 2004 election. So it's going to be messy. But at no stage when you start treading on vested interest is it an easy process. But it will be something that we'll see increasingly happen, because South Africa, unlike the rest of Africa, South Africa is moving towards a 70% urbanization rate. and it will shift the election politics and the constituencies voting increasingly, and these chiefs will, the politics is going to run away from them. It's going to be an interesting decade, but yeah, I think that's what we're going to see.
Okay, there's a question online, and then we'll go to.
Okay, there's a question. It is for all three speakers. It's from Hercules. He's asking, do we have data sharing practices among the farmers, the funders, and the market in a way that we can strengthen the agriculture system in sub-Saharan Africa? And for Prof Ken, at a country level between agriculture departments, for Prof Phillipe, recognizing data as a digital asset that can assist the sector at a fiscal level. And Dr. Qwabe, data literacy at a local level.
Yeah, it's rather complicated.
Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, I'll repeat it. He's asking, do we have data sharing practices among the farmers, the funders, and the market in a way that we can strengthen the agriculture system in sub-Saharan Africa?
Shall I?
At different levels.
Can I pick up on this? I think there's working in, I work across Africa with a whole range of different organizations and in different, particularly from the, if you like, the European donors, but also like the Gates Foundation with other funding bodies for research, and also within Africa. And there's a huge amount of interest in digital solutions. The fact that everybody's got now a smartphone in their pocket, I've got one as well, and that actually gives us access to information and data and things. It's great. It's no doubt going to improve the flow of information. It means that farmers in remote areas can get much better handle on their prices, so that they can avoid, if you like, being ripped off by the first dealer who comes along. They can say, no, I'll wait for a better price from the next one, and so forth. But it's not going to solve everything, obviously. And I think, data sharing, open data, I'm 100% behind it. We were discussing this also around weather data. Weather data has become something commercial. Some of those things should be public goods because they should be at the service of everybody. And so making if you like, public data properly public and not making people pay for it, making sure that if we are collecting data from smallholders, which we do a lot, is actually available to them as well, is really key. So there's an issue here of democratization of data, I think. And it's going to help, but again, it's not going to address all the problems on its own. So I think it's another tool in the armory that we have to use. That would be my take on it. I don't know if my colleagues want to comment.
Sorry, I've forgotten which scale Hercules was asking for me, but I'm going to assume it's smallholder farmers. Data literacy at local level.
Whether people could use the data if they gave it, if they had it, I guess.
Okay, so there's a limitation, number one. And when he says local, I will assume again, because it wasn't very specific, that he is referring to maybe rural communities, I don't know, the previously disadvantaged, let me just put it like that. There's a limitation when it comes to literacy because most of the apps, I will make an example with the app. We've got an app that has been designed by the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where different experts just load information there for the ease of the farmers, commercial farmers, small-scale farmers. And the nice thing about that is that after realizing that there is a challenge that most farmers do not understand because of literacy issues, it now has to be translated to their indigenous language, which is isiZulu in that area. So now it's possible for them to, it's easy for them to understand what is being shared on the app. I'm not sure if I understand Hercules correctly, but I think that would be close to what he's asking.
Okay, thank you very much. There's, I think, one question here.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning. My question is, does the government have a policy for small-scale farming? And if, where can we get it? And then the follow-up question as well is, you've spoken a lot about small-scale farming in the old Bantustan or deep rural, but what about small-scale farming in urban areas, next to urban areas?
Okay, thank you.
It's a South African question.
Yes, Philip, thank you, the best.
Yes, and I think there's lots of opportunities to do that. We know that there is, you know, in many of our townships, there's a gardening culture of people, you know, having a little plot, very small, where they grow vegetables. And it is not just a South African thing. You find that sort of thing across the world. I've seen this being done even in very urban areas like in New York. I visited one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn called East New York, where you have people doing that in, you know, these high rises, you know, but somehow they are able to grow a bit of this, and then there are community markets where these things can be sold on a Saturday morning. So that is one way. There's another interesting concept that I picked up there, and that I think blew over from Japan. But so there they have also a concept called, well, it's very localized. So you would have a city, and then people in the city would all contribute, let's say 100 Rand, or that's the US now, so let's say $100 or whatever in the beginning of a season to a farmer, and that gives them a share in that farmer's, you know, harvest, and there's a shared risk in there, because if it's a bumper crop, you know, so this farmer would have, let's say, 2 or 3 hectares where they grow something, and that is then divided by all the people who contributed to that, you know, to grow it there. And if it's a bumper crop, everybody gets more. If it's below a bumper crop, you know, everybody gets less. But it's almost like a stokvel concept behind that, but it's done with a 50-mile radius from the town. So to keep it local and to empower local farmers. So I think there's a lot of those types of solutions, you know, so that you're not just buying your veggies from Woolies, but you know, it depends on where in the country. Of course, in the Free State, you know, it's going to be a bit more difficult. But if you know, closer to areas where, you know, where crops, for instance, grow better, then it becomes a bit more viable, and maybe here we should do it a bit further than 50 kilometers or 50 miles. You know, so various of these things that we can think about. It's sort of localized solutions to see, and again it goes to the development of those ecosystems we talked about earlier.
Okay. I'll try to respond on policy. The problem with our country is that we have fragmented policies. A lot of them, yes. The Department of Agriculture would come up with what they think is the best policy when it comes to small-scale farming. Social development would do the same, and other departments would do the same as well. So there would not be something solid. So I like what Prof is saying next to me when he refers to them as there's concepts, localized concepts, because there are no existing policies, if I may put it like that, no solid policies that exist, that have been documented. Everything is just fragmented at this stage, unfortunately.
maybe if I could just share an experience from when I was prof at the University of Zimbabwe, we had a project looking at urban and peri-urban production. And the biggest problem we found, I mean, it was very good prices for Kovo and the like, the brassica that people would eat, but the greener it was, the higher the price. And farmers were putting on what they called Compound X, which was 350 kilos of nitrogen every 3 weeks to get the greenest leaf, for one thing. They were using irrigation water, which is often contaminated with sewage, so there were health outbreaks regularly, and we could count large coliform numbers on the cabbages, so if you didn't wash it carefully, you were in trouble. And they were spraying with everything they could find, so they were spraying with washing powder, with DDT, they were spraying insects with fungicides and fungi with insects because of lack of knowledge. So, I mean, I think there's a great opportunity there, but there's a really important thing to do with knowledge. You know, they were irrigating with water that came from the paint works. It would change color by the week. The heavy metal contents of the soils and the vegetables were also very high. So we found just about every problem you could imagine. I think it's great, but I would personally be careful where I bought from and certainly wash it very carefully before I ate it. So put it that way.
Okay. We've come to the
Sure.
end of the discussion, a bit over time. I just wanted to, is there any of the three speakers, is there any final comment you really feel you would like to make?
No, I think we covered it.
Okay. Well, I think I would like to have a big applause for the three speakers. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm not going to recap the discussion. There were some very interesting things. We talked about taboos, and I love taboos actually, and because there's exactly things where you want to kind of dive in deeper. So thanks for the audience. Thanks for everybody who listened online. I also want to a great thank you to Elfrida, because she organized all this, and she did a tremendous good job in getting everything to work and promoting this symposium. So thanks a lot, Elfrida. And well, I think I can close the meeting and have a good day.
Yeah.